Looking back, maybe there were signs. Valari had started taking ballroom classes a few months back. I remember her enthusiasm when she told me she'd signed up. She said it was a chance to try something new, get some exercise, and meet a few people. I thought it was great. I was just glad she had something she enjoyed outside of work. But then she started getting really into it. Classes 2 or 3 times a week, staying later, sometimes even leaving early from our dinners or get-togethers with friends to make it to the studio. I figured it was a phase, that maybe she'd get it out of her system. I never thought twice about her coming home late, flushed and bright-eyed, telling me stories of her improvements on the dance floor. One Tuesday, I was already home from work a bit early, just relaxing on the couch. I had this sudden idea. Why not surprise her by picking her up? I figured I'd bring her her favorite smoothie, and then we could grab a late dinner together. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I showed up a few minutes early, parked right out front, and just waited in the car, scrolling through my phone. The clock hit 8 o'clock, then 8:05, and she still hadn't come out. I figured maybe the class had gone overtime. But by 8:15, I was starting to feel that weird itch in my stomach. I headed inside, thinking I'd just wait by the doors and watch her finish up. But when I walked in, the place was dead silent. All the lights were on, but there was no music, no chatter, just a single guy sweeping up near the entrance. "Hey there," I said, approaching him, still feeling pretty casual about everything. "I'm looking for my wife, Valari. She was supposed to be in the evening ballroom class." He paused, broom in hand, and looked up at me with an awkward smile. "Oh, you're Valari's husband?" he asked, almost surprised, like he hadn't expected anyone to be looking for her. I nodded, feeling that itch in my stomach get a little stronger. "That's right. I just thought I'd surprise her, pick her up," I said, smiling, but there was this unease I couldn't shake. He rubbed his neck and looked around, clearly not wanting to be the one to tell me whatever it was he knew. "Well, sometimes Valari and her dance partner Sean, they don't stay for the whole class," he said slowly, eyes darting away. "They step out for a bit, maybe to practice alone or something," he added, his voice awkward and hesitant. I tried to keep my tone even. "Alone? Are they somewhere in the building?" He shook his head quickly, then shrugged with this half-apologetic look. "Nah, they just kind of leave together. Happens every now and then. Seemed like they might have a thing for each other," he said, almost like he was embarrassed to be saying it. I just stood there for a second, not quite believing what I was hearing. The drive home from that studio felt like one long, slow punch to the gut. I could barely process what the coach had hinted at. Maybe I was reading too much into things, but hearing it out loud, that my wife and her dance partner might have a thing for each other, was enough to make my chest feel tight. My mind was spinning, replaying every odd look, every late night, every little thing I might have ignored or explained away over the past few months. When I finally got home, the house felt eerily quiet. Her shoes were by the door, her purse on the counter, and a couple of dance magazines were spread out on the coffee table, the pages open to articles on perfecting certain moves. I felt this mix of anger and confusion just looking at those magazines, realizing I didn't even know her dance partner's name until tonight. I decided not to confront her right away. Instead, I tried to keep things normal, waiting up with my laptop on the couch, pretending to be absorbed in some work emails. I heard her keys jingle in the door around 9:30, a full hour and a half after class was supposed to end. She came in with her usual energy, cheeks flushed, hair slightly damp like she'd been sweating. I'd seen that look a dozen times since she started taking the classes, and it never once bothered me, until now. "Hey honey," she greeted me with a bright smile, setting her dance bag down by the door. "Didn't think you'd still be up. Thought I'd wait for you," I said, keeping my tone casual, watching her closely. She tossed her hair back and walked over, her whole demeanor light and casual, like she didn't have a care in the world. "Well, I hope you didn't wait up too long. Class was good tonight. Sean and I really nailed a few steps we've been working on." That name, Sean. Hearing her say it out loud, with that light in her eyes, was like another punch to the gut. She went on about the steps, talking about some new move they'd tried, how they'd finally got the chemistry right. She said that word chemistry so easily like it meant nothing, while I just sat there feeling like I was watching a stranger. I forced a smile and nodded, letting her go on, letting her think everything was normal. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop replaying that conversation with the coach and the way Valari had looked when she came home, flushed and full of excitement. Her words kept haunting me. We finally got the chemistry right. I'd convinced myself that maybe it was nothing, maybe she was just passionate about dancing and this Sean guy was just a partner. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She'd always been a bit of a night owl, and now her late practices were happening more often. Twice in 1 week, she texted me around 7:30 saying she'd be staying late to practice with Sean. I tried to be understanding, even as that sick feeling in my stomach grew every time I got one of those messages. One night, when she got home a bit after 10 o'clock, I noticed something strange. Her perfume was faint but still there. Odd because I knew how much she hated wearing perfume when she danced. It distracts me, she'd once told me. But there it was, subtle but present. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to cover something up. Then there was her phone. Valari had always been open with her phone, leaving it around without a second thought. But now, I noticed her putting it on silent and keeping it face down on the table. I'd catch her glancing at it when she thought I wasn't looking, her fingers hovering over the screen as if waiting for something. She'd smile at me and act natural, but I could see the tension in her eyes, the way her laughter seemed a little too forced, her movements a little too hurried. One night, she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered, and I found myself staring at it, heart pounding, torn between wanting to trust her and needing to know the truth. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't bring myself to cross that line. Not yet. But the doubts kept building, every detail adding to the weight of suspicion hanging between us. It's hard to explain, but once those doubts start creeping in, every little thing feels like a clue. I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before, like the way she'd seem a little too cheerful before heading off to her dance class. She'd spend extra time picking out her clothes, sometimes even trying on a couple of different outfits. I tried to tell myself that I was overthinking it, that it was normal for her to want to look good. But it felt strange, seeing her fuss over her reflection before a class that should have been all about sweat and practice. The biggest tip-off, though, came on a Friday night. I'd invited a few friends over for a beer and game night, something we did every so often to unwind. Valari was supposed to be at her class, but she'd come home part way through. I remember feeling oddly tense about her coming back, like part of me didn't want my friends to see her, afraid they'd pick up on something I wasn't ready to admit myself. When she walked in, her hair was a bit too perfect, and she didn't have that usual worn-out look from a long dance session. She had a smile on her face that seemed different. One of my buddies, Matt, noticed right away. He'd always had this knack for reading people and situations, and he was staring at her with that half-smile, like he knew something I didn't. I tried to brush it off, tried to act like nothing was wrong. After she said hello and disappeared upstairs to shower, Matt leaned in close and gave me a look. "She's really been into those dance classes, huh?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes studying me. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Yeah, it's her thing now," I said. But Matt didn't let it drop. "She doesn't come off as the ballroom type," he said, with a smirk. "You sure she's just dancing there?" He said it like a joke, but the words hung in the air between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I laughed it off, or at least tried to. But inside, it felt like Matt had just called out the elephant in the room that I'd been trying so hard to ignore. Later that night, after everyone left, I found myself alone in the quiet of the living room, replaying every small sign, every strange detail, every look she'd given me in the last few weeks. I knew I was reaching a point where I couldn't just push it all aside. If I didn't confront her soon, I'd go mad with suspicion. By the time I decided to follow Valari, I already knew in my gut something was wrong. Her late-night practices had gone from occasional to almost routine, and every time she left for class, she seemed to be in a rush, like she couldn't wait to get out the door. She'd smile and wave, that same cheerful, carefree expression on her face, and I'd watch her pull out of the driveway, feeling more and more like a stranger in my own life. On Thursday night, I finally reached my breaking point. I waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed my keys and followed, staying far enough back to avoid raising suspicion. I kept telling myself I was crazy, that I'd drive out there and find nothing. Maybe they'd just be at the studio, practicing steps on the dance floor. But a part of me knew better, and the sick feeling in my stomach wouldn't let go. I parked down the street from the studio, watching the entrance from a spot that kept me out of sight. The minutes crawled by, and I felt every single one of them. I watched as a few other dancers came and went, but I didn't see her. Then, finally, she stepped out, and she wasn't alone. Sean was right beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. They paused just outside the door, sharing a look that lingered longer than it should have. Then she laughed, a soft, quiet laugh that I recognized but hadn't heard in months. They moved down the street together, a little too close, with a little too much ease between them. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I followed, keeping enough distance to stay out of view but close enough that I couldn't lose them. Every so often, Valari would glance around, scanning the street. She looked cautious, almost jumpy, like she knew someone might be watching. But it didn't stop her from sliding her hand around Sean's arm as they walked. They didn't head to a coffee shop or a quiet corner for a casual chat. Instead, I watched as they turned into the parking lot of a small, inconspicuous hotel just a mile from the studio. It was one of those places with flickering lights and worn paint, the kind of place no one paid attention to. I pulled over a short distance away, close enough to see but far enough that they wouldn't notice. My jaw clenched as I watched them disappear through a side door, completely at ease with each other, completely oblivious to the fact that I was there. I just sat there in my car, staring at that door, as the weight of what I'd suspected all along finally sank in. The next few nights, I did the same thing. Each time she said she was off to practice, I waited a few minutes, followed her, and watched her meet Sean. Every time, they'd end up at that same hotel, slipping into that same side door. It didn't matter what night it was, or how late she'd promised to be, this was their routine. And each time, my stomach churned a little more, and the sickening truth settled deeper. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. After a week of following Valari and Sean to that hotel, I realized I couldn't keep doing this alone. It was like living in a nightmare, seeing the same scene play out over and over, knowing I couldn't stop it. But I needed to be smart about how I handled it. I couldn't confront them without hard proof, and honestly, I didn't want to go in there guns blazing and make a scene. I wanted her to feel every ounce of betrayal I was feeling. That's when I thought about Gabby, Sean's wife. I knew of her only vaguely. Valari had mentioned her a couple of times in passing, describing her as sweet and reserved, but I'd never actually met her. I figured if anyone had a right to know what was going on, it was her. So, I did a little digging, finding her contact info without much trouble. After a bit of hesitation, I sent her a message, asking if we could meet to discuss something important. I kept it vague, but she agreed. We met in a small coffee shop on a Saturday afternoon. She looked about as nervous as I felt, glancing around the place before spotting me and giving me a hesitant wave. Gabby was petite, with soft features and kind eyes that looked a little tired, like she'd been carrying a weight of her own. I wondered if she'd suspected anything, if she was here because she'd already felt that creeping sense of betrayal too. After we sat down, I decided not to drag it out. Gabby, I started, keeping my voice low, I don't know how else to say this, so I'll just be straightforward. I think my wife, Valari, is having an affair with Sean. Her face froze, her eyes widening as she took in what I'd just said. She looked down at her coffee, fingers shaking slightly as she clutched the cup. I waited, giving her a moment to process it. She took a deep breath, then looked up at me, her eyes filled with both hurt and relief. I had a feeling, she admitted softly. Sean's been so distant lately, and he's started spending all this extra time at his dance classes. She practically whispered the words, as if saying it out loud made it all too real. I thought maybe it was just a phase, or that he really was just busy with his new hobby. But deep down I think I knew. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared pain filling the space between us. Finally she straightened, her expression turning from sorrow to resolve. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, but filled with a kind of determination I hadn't expected. "We catch them," I replied, feeling that same resolve building up inside me. "I've followed them a few times now. They go to the same hotel after every class. If we work together, we can confront them and get proof." Gabby nodded slowly, her jaw clenched. "I need to see it with my own eyes," she murmured. "I need to know for sure." We spent the rest of that afternoon going over the details. We agreed to pick a night when we'd both show up at that hotel and confront them together, catching them in the act. Gabby wanted to bring a camera, some way to document the whole thing. I felt a little twisted for planning it out like this, but honestly, it was the only way I'd be able to show Valari that I knew everything, that there was no running from the truth. By the time we left, we had a plan. Gabby thanked me, her voice trembling as she promised to keep in touch until the day of our sting. Watching her walk out of that coffee shop, I felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve. We were both victims in this, both blindsided by people we loved. And together, we were going to make sure they faced the consequences of their choices. After meeting with Gabby, the days felt like a countdown. I didn't tell Valari anything, didn't act any different, just kept the plan in my head and went through the motions, waiting for the night we'd agreed on. It was surreal, sitting at the dinner table with her, hearing her talk about her day, pretending everything was fine, knowing that in just a few days, her double life would be laid bare. Gabby and I kept in touch through quick, careful messages, planning every last detail. She'd managed to buy a small camera that she could hide in her bag. We decided to meet at the hotel around the time they usually arrived, and then, once they were in their room, we'd slip in and catch them together. Gabby was nervous but determined, and honestly, so was I. I felt anger simmering under the surface, but I kept it under control. This wasn't just about getting revenge, it was about making sure I got the truth in a way she couldn't deny. Finally, the night came. Valari had left for her class, telling me she might be a little late because they had some extra routines to work on. The lie was almost laughable now. I watched her leave, the familiar routine playing out one last time. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed my keys, took a deep breath, and headed out to meet Gabby. I got to the hotel about 10 minutes before Valari and Sean usually arrived. Gabby was already there, standing off to the side, looking tense but focused. She gave me a quick nod as I approached, her jaw set with a determination that mirrored my own. We didn't talk much. There wasn't anything left to say. We both knew why we were here and what we needed to do. A few minutes later, I spotted them. Valari and Sean strolled up together, laughing quietly, completely unaware that their night was about to turn. They entered the hotel through the side entrance, just like every other time I'd watched them, and headed down the hall. Gabby and I waited a few moments, just long enough for them to settle in, then followed. We reached the door, and for a split second, I felt a pang of doubt. But as I glanced at Gabby, who was staring at that door with steely resolve, I knew there was no turning back. She nodded, and I took a deep breath, pushing the door open. The scene inside was exactly what I'd imagined but 10 times worse. They were wrapped up in each other, completely oblivious to the world around them. The look of shock on Valari's face when she saw us standing there was something I'd never forget. In that instant, everything she'd hidden was dragged into the light. Gabby, with shaking hands but a steady voice, raised the camera, capturing the evidence. Neither of them had words. They stammered, reaching for excuses that neither of us cared to hear. This was the truth, raw and exposed, and there was no running from it. After a few moments of stunned silence, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I didn't need to yell, didn't need to lash out. Just being there, standing in the truth of what they'd done, was enough. Gabby and I turned and left, leaving them behind with the mess they'd created. The drive home after the confrontation was strangely silent. Gabby and I didn't speak. We didn't need to. We'd both seen exactly what we came to find, and now the image of it felt seared into my memory. It was like the entire night was on autopilot, just this numb sense of finality sinking in. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt exhausted, like I'd been running on empty for months and finally hit a wall. When I got inside, I poured a drink and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the empty spot where Valari usually sat. 4 years, that spot had felt like a part of our life together, filled with her laughter, her stories, her complaints about work. Now it was just a reminder of the lies she'd fed me, night after night. I didn't know when she'd be back, or if she even would, but I didn't care. It was late when I heard her car pull up. She came in slowly, almost cautiously, as if she didn't know what she'd find waiting for her. I didn't move, didn't say a word as she walked in and stopped dead in her tracks, eyes wide as she spotted me at the table. She looked a mess, like she'd been crying, her makeup smudged and her hair in disarray. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She just stood there, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for something to say that could make any of this better. But she knew, and I knew, there was no saving it now. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until finally, she took a small, shaky breath and spoke. "Cody," she started, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to say." I stared at her, feeling like I was looking at a stranger. This was the woman I'd trusted, the one I thought would always be by my side. Now, standing there in front of me, she looked like a shadow of the person I thought I knew. "Maybe there's nothing to say, Valari," I replied, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "I've seen everything I need to." She flinched, the weight of her guilt finally sinking in, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. Not after what I'd just witnessed. Not after the weeks of suspicion and doubt that she'd put me through. She tried to say something, to explain herself, but I cut her off. "I don't need excuses, Valari. I don't want your apologies. Just pack your things." I watched her break down right there, but I didn't look away. She begged, trying to explain, saying it was a mistake, that it had just happened. But the words meant nothing. Each excuse just felt like another slap in the face, and all I could think about was how this had become my life. My marriage reduced to lies and betrayal. When she finally realized there was no convincing me, she nodded, defeated, and turned to head upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table, listening to her pack, each rustling sound another piece of the life we'd built crumbling apart. I knew that after tonight, there was no going back. She'd crossed a line, and there was no repairing the damage. She left without another word, taking only a bag of clothes and leaving her ring on the counter. The house felt emptier than it ever had, even though I'd wanted her gone. I sat there for hours, the quiet settling around me, and for the first time since all this started, I felt like I could finally breathe. The days after Valari left were filled with a strange kind of silence. I went through my routine like nothing had happened, but everywhere I looked, there were reminders of her. Her shoes still sat by the door, her favorite mug still hung on the kitchen rack, and her half-read books were piled on her bedside table. Every time I noticed these pieces of her, I felt the betrayal settle deeper, like an ache that wouldn't go away. I couldn't just sit around, stewing in it. The anger, the humiliation, it was all building up, and I needed to do something with it. That's when I decided to go public. If she dragged my name through the dirt with this affair, why should she get to keep her reputation intact? It didn't seem fair that she could move on while I was left to pick up the pieces alone. I wanted people to know the truth. It started with a single post on social media. I kept it brief but blunt, laying out what had happened without sparing any of the ugly details. I didn't mention Sean's name, but I made it clear that her affair wasn't some mistake she could shrug off. It was a betrayal that had shattered our marriage. I kept it factual, restrained, just enough to get my story out there. The post caught fire faster than I expected. Friends, family, even acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years started reaching out, some offering their support, others shocked by what they were reading. A few of Valari's friends even messaged me, some of them stunned, some defensive, trying to explain that it was complicated, or maybe there was more to the story. But I didn't care about their sympathy or their defenses. I'd spent too long believing her lies, and I wasn't going to let anyone convince me to excuse what she'd done. Gabby reached out soon after the post went up. She thanked me for having the courage to put it all out there. I could tell from her tone that she'd been suffering too, dealing with her own friends and family, breaking down her marriage to Sean in the aftermath. She even shared that a few of their mutual friends had already cut ties with Sean, disgusted by what he'd done. Gabby was planning on filing for divorce as soon as she could. There was no going back for her either. I started hearing whispers that people in our community, the same ones who'd known and respected Valari for years, were distancing themselves from her. A few people in her social circles blocked her entirely. I found out she'd been rejected from a job she'd interviewed for recently, and while part of me felt guilty, another part couldn't help but feel some justice in it. She'd lied, cheated, and shattered what we had. She didn't deserve to move on scot-free. My story came to light, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over something. I was no longer just a bystander in my own life, hiding in the shadows of what she had done. And when the messages and calls asking for support kept coming, I realized I wasn't alone. As a distraction, Gabby and I agreed to go somewhere fun the following week. The morning of the trip, Gabby and I met at a coffee shop, both of us looking forward to a day away from everything familiar. She pulled up in her little red car, wearing a casual sundress and a big smile that somehow made me feel lighter just looking at her. We'd planned to visit a small town about 2 hours away, a quiet place with old shops, galleries, and a beach nearby. Neither of us had been there before, and that was the point. Somewhere without memories, without ties, where we could just enjoy the day. The drive was easy, filled with music, good conversation, and that comfortable silence that only happens with someone you trust. Gabby laughed at my questionable taste in road trip music, and I teased her about her endless supply of snacks. It felt like we'd known each other for years, like we'd just picked up a friendship we'd put down ages ago. When we arrived, the town was quiet and welcoming, with narrow cobblestone streets and small, quirky stores lining the main road. We wandered through a used bookstore first, flipping through old, dusty covers and laughing at the ancient romance novels with cheesy titles. She picked up an old detective novel, saying it was her favorite genre, and I grabbed an old travel guide as a kind of keepsake from the day. We kept wandering, taking our time, exploring little art galleries and antique shops, losing track of time. At one point, we found a small bakery tucked between two shops and decided to grab a snack. We sat by the window, watching people pass by while splitting a blueberry scone. Gabby told me about a childhood trip she'd taken to a place like this with her grandparents, sharing how she used to dream of having her own cozy place in a quiet town someday. I could picture her here, happy, with that light in her eyes. It was nice to see her smile, knowing she'd been through her own storm and was finding her way out, just like I was. As we left the bakery, we wandered down a path that led to the beach. It was empty, the sand stretching out quietly under a wide-open sky, and we walked along the shore, our feet sinking in the sand, letting the waves lap over our toes. I watched her walk ahead, the breeze in her hair, her laugh echoing as she teased me about keeping up. And in that moment, everything felt like it was falling into place. Gabby stopped, looking out at the waves, and then she turned back to me, her smile soft and calm. "Feels good to just be, doesn't it?" she said, looking out over the water. "Yeah," I replied, meaning it more than I thought I would. "Feels like a fresh start." We spent a while there, talking about what we both wanted next. A simple life, happiness, maybe a home with someone who actually cared. No grand plans, just the idea of something real and steady, something we could build from scratch. I could feel my old bitterness fading with each minute we stood there, the weight of everything finally slipping away. I hadn't realized just how much I needed this day, this simple escape from everything until I was there. By the time we got back to my place that evening, my head felt clear. I knew what I had to do. After she left, I walked through the house, collecting the last of Valari's things. Her favorite mug, a couple of sweaters, her half-used perfume bottles. I boxed it all up, sealing the memories inside, and set the box by the door, ready to take it to her mom's place or drop it off at a donation center. The house was mine now, but more than that, I felt like I'd finally taken back my life. Gabby had helped me find that spark again, that hope I thought I'd lost. The future wasn't about carrying the past anymore, it was about building something new, with someone who understood exactly what it meant to start over. As I stood there in the quiet house, I realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't angry or hurt. I was just free. And with Gabby, I had something real to look forward to. The next day, I woke up feeling like I'd finally turned a page. The house was still and quiet, but instead of feeling empty, it felt open, like a blank slate, ready for new memories. I thought about Gabby, and how every time we spent together felt like another step forward, away from the past and toward something solid and real. Around noon, I texted her, suggesting we take a drive and check out a new place. A half hour later, she texted back, "Let's do it. I'll bring snacks." It was something simple, but I felt a familiar excitement I hadn't felt in ages. I grabbed my keys, feeling like a teenager about to pick up his first date. When I got to Gabby's place, she was waiting outside, holding a cooler and wearing that easy smile that always made me feel lighter. She threw the cooler in the back, and we headed out, not really caring where we were going, just enjoying the ride. She'd found an old playlist of 90s songs, and we spent the first part of the drive belting out lyrics we barely remembered and laughing whenever we messed them up. We drove for hours, turning down random roads, stopping at a little diner on the edge of a quiet town we'd never even heard of. It was the kind of place with a chalkboard menu, checkered curtains, and waitresses who called you Han. We ordered milkshakes and burgers, and somewhere between sips, Gabby started talking about her life before everything had gone south. She told me about her dreams of opening her own art studio, how she'd put it off for years, waiting for the right time. Hearing her talk about it, I could see the spark in her eyes. Something I hadn't seen in a long time, in her or anyone. I felt proud of her, like I was watching her come back to life after everything she'd been through. After we finished our food, we took a walk down the quiet main street, exploring the little shops and antique stores, talking about what we wanted to do with our lives now that we'd been handed a clean slate. We didn't have answers yet, but being able to dream out loud again felt like its own kind of victory. We ended up in a little art gallery at the end of the street, full of local paintings and sketches. Gabby's face lit up as she took in each piece, studying the lines and colors with that intense focus I was starting to love. She turned to me, a spark in her eyes. "What would you think if I don't know, rented a little place, tried my hand at running my own studio? Just something small, to see if it could work." I didn't hesitate. "I think you'd be incredible at it, Gabby. I can already see people lining up for your work." She laughed, a little shyly, but I could tell she was seriously considering it. "Maybe it's time to go for it," she said, almost to herself. And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, we'd both be taking those steps forward together, supporting each other in ways that only people who'd been through this kind of heartbreak could understand. As we headed back to the car, Gabby spotted a small pottery bowl, painted in deep blues and grays, and picked it up. She insisted on buying it, saying it was her first piece for her future studio. Seeing her so hopeful, talking about her dreams, reminded me that we were building something here. New dreams, new memories, a new future. The drive home was quiet, with a comfortable silence between us. As I dropped her off at her place, she reached over and gave my hand a quick squeeze. "Thanks, Cody," she said softly. "For everything. I wouldn't have made it here without you." I watched her go, feeling more certain than ever that this wasn't just a way to move past the pain. It was something real, something worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just healing. I was growing, moving forward with someone who'd become more than just a friend. A few days after our day trip, I was cleaning up around the house when I realized something. For the first time since this mess started, I wanted Gabby to see this place. Not as the old house where I'd lived with Valari, but as a new space, a place I could finally make my own. She'd seen bits of it on her visits, but I'd never fully let her into my world here. So, I decided to change that. I messaged her, inviting her over for dinner, and offered to cook. I kept it casual, not letting on how much it meant to me, but her response was instant and enthusiastic. Sounds perfect. I'll bring dessert. I spent the day cleaning, putting the final touches on the rooms I'd rearranged after clearing out the last of Valari's things. I wanted the house to feel fresh, with no shadows of the past lingering in any corner. I replaced some of the old photos I'd taken down with new art prints and rearranged the living room to make it feel more open and welcoming. It was small stuff, but somehow, it felt like the house was finally becoming mine. When Gabby arrived, she looked around with a smile, taking in the changes I'd made. "It feels different," she said, giving me a warm smile. "It feels like you." Hearing her say that meant more than I expected. I'd wanted this place to feel like a home again, not just for me but as a place where I could invite new memories and people in. And tonight, I wanted her to feel like she belonged here. I made us pasta with a homemade marinara sauce, and we opened a bottle of wine I'd saved for a special occasion. As we ate, Gabby looked around, her eyes lingering on the new prints and the freshly arranged shelves. She knew the significance of each change, and I could tell she felt honored to be part of this moment. Over dinner, we talked about everything and nothing. Work, favorite books, random memories from our childhoods. I learned that she'd been an artist since she was young, always painting and sketching on any scrap of paper she could find. She told me about her favorite painting as a kid, a big mural of a mountain landscape her dad had taken her to see on a trip, and how she'd wanted to recreate it one day. Watching her light up as she talked, I felt a quiet happiness settle over me. Gabby wasn't just someone who understood my pain. She was becoming someone I could see myself building something new with. After dinner, we moved to the living room, sitting on the couch with the last of the wine, talking until the stars came out. We shared stories about dreams we hadn't admitted to anyone else. She told me more about her idea for a studio, how she imagined it looking, how she wanted it to feel like a creative haven for people looking to escape their everyday routines. "Maybe one day, I could help you put it together," I offered, half joking but mostly serious. Her eyes softened, and she looked at me with an expression that was more than just gratitude. "I'd like that," she said, her voice quiet but full of something deeper. "I'd really like that, Cody." As the night went on, I felt that familiar spark between us grow stronger. It wasn't forced or complicated, it was natural, steady, a feeling that went beyond just comfort. By the time she got up to leave, I realized that letting Gabby into my life, into my home, wasn't just about filling an empty space. It was about building something real, something solid, with someone who wanted the same kind of new beginning I did. As I walked her to the door, she turned back, pausing just a moment longer. "Thank you, Cody," she said, her voice soft, "for letting me be a part of this." And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, we'd be facing it together. Watching her walk down the driveway, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over me. This wasn't about moving on or forgetting the past. It was about finding someone who made life feel full again, who brought light back into the quiet corners. And for the first time, I felt ready for whatever came next, because I knew Gabby would be right there beside me. After Gabby and I started dating, life just felt right. What had started as friendship had grown into something steady and real, something I hadn't felt in years. We fell into an easy routine, spending weekends together, trying new restaurants, going to art galleries. Anything that let us carve out a world that was ours. It wasn't long before I realized that just seeing her at the end of a day made everything easier, and I didn't want her to leave each time she'd go home. The idea of her being in my life, every day, just felt natural. One evening, while we were watching a movie, she was curled up on the couch beside me, her head resting on my shoulder. As I watched her, it just hit me, and I spoke before I could talk myself out of it. "Move in with me," I said, softly, hoping she'd hear all the meaning behind the words. She looked up, a bit surprised but with a hint of a smile. "Are you sure, Cody?" she asked, searching my eyes, as if she needed to know this was real. I took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I've never been more sure," I said, and the relief that washed over me was instant. Over the next few weeks, she started bringing her life into my home, one box at a time. Each time she'd show up with another box, her favorite art supplies, her books, a pile of fluffy blankets. It felt like she was leaving a bit of herself here, and the house was transforming into something new, something shared. With every picture she hung on the wall, every favorite mug she added to the cabinet, it felt less like my place and more like our home. One Saturday, as we were finishing the last of the unpacking, Gabby pulled out a flyer she'd stashed away and held it up with a playful grin. "What do you think about getting a dog?" she asked. I laughed, the idea of it sounding more appealing than I expected. "I think it's a great idea," I replied, knowing she was just as ready to start this new chapter as I was. The next weekend, we visited a local shelter and met Max, a black lab mix with a big heart and even bigger paws. He wagged his tail so hard when he saw us that he nearly toppled over, and Gabby looked at me, her eyes bright with excitement. We didn't even have to discuss it. He was coming home with us. From the moment we brought Max home, he felt like he'd always been part of our lives. He followed Gabby from room to room, watching her paint, and at night, he'd curl up on the couch next to me, resting his head on my knee, as if he'd known us forever. Our evenings were now filled with Max's playful energy. Our walks became routine, and he quickly became the heart of our new little family. With Gabby and Max, life felt complete in a way I hadn't anticipated. Each morning, I'd wake up to see her in the kitchen, making coffee with Max lying at her feet, waiting for his morning treat. We'd talk over breakfast, sharing our plans for the day, and laugh as Max tried to sneak food off our plates when we weren't looking. Every day was filled with simple joys, and I'd never felt more at home. Evenings became our favorite time together. We'd walk Max through the neighborhood, arm in arm, watching the sunset or wandering through the quiet park trails. We'd stop by a little dog-friendly cafe sometimes, sitting outside with our coffee, watching Max charm every stranger who walked by. Later, back at home, we'd cook dinner together, our movements so in sync it felt like we'd been doing it for years. Little by little, Gabby and I were building a life that felt solid and real. It was a home filled with new memories, fresh starts, and laughter. No longer was the house haunted by old pains or shadows of the past. Now it was a space of healing, of love, and of moving forward together. And with every day that passed, I knew that this life, with her and Max by my side, was exactly where I was meant to be. With our family growing and dreams of a new house taking shape, life felt full and vibrant. Gabby and I savored the days spent together, balancing work, raising our kids, and planning for the future. Jack had brought a new joy into our lives, and Lily was an enthusiastic big sister, doting on him at every turn. The house was lively with laughter, and Max was never far from the kids, his loyal presence a reminder of how much our lives had changed since we first brought him home. Our careers were thriving too. Gabby's art was being recognized in bigger galleries, and I could see how much she had grown as an artist. Watching her passion unfold and seeing her find her own success was something I cherished. She was so dedicated and talented, and every time she got a new opportunity, it felt like we were both winning. My own job had taken off in ways I hadn't anticipated. With each new project and promotion, I felt a growing sense of purpose and pride, not just in what I was doing, but in what it meant for our family. We could finally consider moving into the kind of house we'd always dreamed about, a place with room for the kids to grow, for Gabby's studio, and for us to build even more memories together. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Gabby and I sat on the couch with Max sprawled at our feet, looking through listings for our potential new home. We laughed, pointing out features we liked or didn't, but every option sparked excitement. We both wanted the same things: a big yard, rooms filled with natural light, and space where our family could thrive. It was thrilling to imagine this next step, knowing how much it represented everything we'd overcome and achieved. As I watched Gabby talking animatedly about design ideas for the kids' rooms, I felt a deep, quiet gratitude. This was the life I'd once only hoped for, a life that made all the struggles of the past feel far away. I leaned over and kissed her, feeling the weight of everything we'd built together, and knowing that this was just the beginning. Together, we were unstoppable. After months of planning, saving, and dreaming, Gabby and I finally found the perfect home. It was a beautiful house on a quiet street, with large windows that let in the morning sun, a backyard big enough for Max and the kids to play, and enough space for Gabby's studio. Walking through it for the first time, we could picture our family here, celebrating holidays, making memories, filling every corner with love. This wasn't just a house. It was our future, everything we'd worked for together. The weeks leading up to the move were a whirlwind of packing and saying goodbye to the place that had seen so much of our journey. It was bittersweet, leaving the home where we'd started our lives together, but as we boxed up each room, it felt like we were packing up a chapter, ready to open a new one. The memories weren't leaving, they'd always be a part of us, but we were moving forward, our sights set on what was to come. Moving day was chaotic but filled with excitement. Friends and family came to help, filling the new house with laughter from the moment we walked in. Lily ran from room to room, her excitement contagious, while Gabby and I worked to settle everything in place. By the time night fell, we were exhausted but happy, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and the quiet hum of contentment. That night, after the kids were asleep and Max had curled up at our feet, Gabby and I sat together in the living room, soaking in the peace of our new home. The past felt like a distant memory, replaced by the joy and warmth of our life together. As we looked around, I felt that familiar gratitude swell up. This was everything we'd dreamed of, a fresh start filled with love, laughter, and a future as bright as we'd always hoped for.